The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hello, I'm Alison Larkin, writer, comedian, narrator, and host of the Jane Austen podcast. Join me as we embark on a journey through Austen's timeless stories, starting with Pride and Prejudice. The Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today I'm talking about our latest book club pick. So every now and then, I'm not going to say monthly because it's just when I'm so moved by a book that I know that the Tits Out Brigade is going to love it, that I choose a book to be a Vulgar History book club pick. And this was like, I couldn't not choose this. I was so excited when I first heard about this book being announced. When it came out, I had to ask if we could be the book club for this. And obviously, Flora Carr, the author of The Tower, was into this idea. She listens to the podcast. She knows about the Tits Out Brigade. And here we all are. So The Tower by Flora Carr is a book that is now available, or actually, if you're listening to this live, or not live, but like the day that it comes out, March 6th. So on March 5th, yesterday, this book went for sale in the North America, in US and Canada. And then tomorrow, March 7th, it's going to be available for sale in the UK and Commonwealth countries. So basically, if you haven't pre-ordered the book already, like just go out this weekend, pick up a copy from your local independent store, or I've got links in the show notes so you can buy a copy online. Go to your library, place your library holds, because you're going to want to read this book. So The Tower is a historical fiction novel by Flora Carr that is all about Mary Queen of Scots at Lochleven, which, as you'll recall, we did a whole episode about this in the Mary Queen of Scots series. That's where she was taken to the island prison, where the people who were there with her included Mary Seton from the Four Marys, but also a certain young teenage boy called young Willy was there. And she did a series of escape attempts that involved like switching clothes with Mary Seton, sneaking away, pretending she was a washerwoman, but then like her hands were too clean and then they wouldn't let her escape. Eventually she did escape in an Ocean's 11 level heist that was so extra and so everything. And we recapped that. Allison Epstein was with me for that episode. There's a whole thing where it's like, when you see me find this earring, that's a signal to do this. Like, it's such a great heist in history, a thing that happened. The Tower is a novel, like it includes the heist escape, but also is just like, what was it like for Mary Queen of Scots to be trapped in this island prison for 11 months. And this was after she had been defeated by the asshole lords and Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart because they wanted her to abdicate so that her son could be the new baby king with Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart as the regent. So they sent her to this island prison. She was pregnant at the time, allegedly with twins, because the Bothwell scenario had just happened. Anyway, and then after this, she does escape. Not spoiler, because you've probably heard that episode. And she went on to challenge the asshole lords and all kinds of stuff that wound up with her going to England. But this is a part when I did the episode about the Lochleven scenario several months ago when we were doing the Mary Queen of Scots situation. I think I said, like, this, why is this never a movie? Why is this never a book? Like, this narrative is so everything. Like, it's a success story for Mary Queen of Scots. And so many of the projects about her are always about her being defeated or her being sad. But this is like a time where she kind of like, after the David Rizzio murder, where she just like, the plans she comes up with when her back is against the wall are incredible. The Tower. So it's a book that takes place during these 11 months. Like, it starts, and again, it's a novel, so you can get into more interesting, like imagining what are people thinking? What were they saying? So it starts with her arriving at Lochleven, and the book just takes place all there, except for kind of flashbacks and memories. And it's such a good book. There's also a queer love story in it, and it's really mainly about the women. It's entirely about the women. It's about Mary Queen of Scots, the chambermaids who are there with her, who are characters in the book. Mary Seton arrives, and then kind of the female jailers who she was there with also, which were like Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart's mom is one of them. Anyway, it's a story. It's such a vulgar history coded book, I say, in the most complimentary way. I tell Flora this in the interview you're about to hear. Like, I open the book and it starts with, there's a cast of characters explaining who is who. And it's just a list of, it's like Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary Seton, young Willy, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart. I'm just like, I had to put the book down because I was so overwhelmed. I'm just like, these are my guys. These are my little guys. Like, Lindsay is there. I'm just like, all the people, like Ruthven, just these names bring back so many memories from that season of the podcast. And then, I mean, she does use their actual names. She doesn't say Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart. And then I started reading the book, and it's like Mary Queen of Scots being taken to Lochleven. And I'm just like, oh my God, it's just so exciting to see this amazing real life situation turned into this incredible novel. And I really, when I first read an early copy of it, I was just like, I'm dying to talk about this with everyone. Actually, shout out to a friend of the podcast, friend of mine, Allison Epstein, who was the first person who heard about this book and told me about it and put it on my radar. And ever since she mentioned it, I've been so excited to read it. And now it's finally being published, and we're going to spend all month talking about it as a book club. So how the book club is going to work is that I'm going to be posting discussion questions on Instagram, where we're at Vulgar History Pod. So every week I'm going to have a discussion question. Actually, I'll let you know, today I'm posting the first one for this week, which is just, what are you most excited to read about in this book? So it's a discussion question for people who haven't read the book yet because it was just published. But what are you most excited, and why are you excited to read this book will be our first question. And then there's also going to be a series of questions also I'm posting for free on the Patreon, like I did last time with our previous book club. So you can join the Patreon for free to comment on those ones as well. So for people who are not on Instagram or who prefer Patreon for discussions, how to get there is you go to vulgarhistory.com/book club, and all the book club questions will be there as well. It's going to be slightly different questions in both places. So if you want to take part in both sets of discussions, feel free. So today I'm talking with Flora about the book. And then at the end of the month, I'm going to be having a video chat with Flora that I'm going to post online as well after we do it. And that's going to be where today's discussion, Flora and I are just talking about the book in the most awkwardly non-spoilery way, because I know the people listening to this know the history really well. And her book has those historical events, but there's other stuff in the book. So we mostly talk about the history. But then our video chat we're having towards the end of the month, when many of you will have read the book, is we're going to get into spoiler discussion, like how she made the decisions she made. You know, there's characters in the book like the chambermaids who were like, she came up with their personalities and their stories and their hopes and dreams. So we're going to have a spoiler-filled discussion in a couple weeks in a video chat. Today, I'm just introducing you all to Flora and to this book, and I had so much fun talking about her. I love these episodes that we sometimes have where, like, I know the minute detail about a historical person, and I'm talking to somebody who's written a book about it, so they have the same minute knowledge about the person, and we can just like really nerd out about it. And anyway, like please enjoy this conversation with Flora Carr and stay tuned afterwards. I'll just have some reminders and some news of my own. So enjoy this interview and talk to you in a bit. So I am very excited to be joined today by Flora Carr, author of this month's Vulgar History book club pick, The Tower. Welcome, Flora.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Anne.
So when I first heard about your book, which was from my friend of the podcast, Alison Epstein, who I think she approached you to read it before it was even, I think you sent her a Word document. Like she heard about it very early.
Yes, and I remember when you reached out to me, because this feels, being on this podcast, a very full circle moment, because I remember, I think you messaged me, I think almost on the day that it was formally announced that I had the publishing deal. And I remember you sort of private messaged me, and it was such a wonderful moment for me, because not only was it a sense of, oh, this is real, this is really happening. At that moment, it still felt very surreal that I had a publishing deal. But also, it really gave me a sense of, oh, I think actually people might be interested to read this book. So it gave me a real boost. I was so happy when you messaged me. So yeah, and also this is my first podcast recording for the book in general. So it's wonderful to be here. Yeah, full circle moment.
That's lovely. Yeah, listeners don't know how early I approach authors to be on this podcast. When I first heard that a book exists, I'm just like, hi, in approximately 9 months, do you want to be on my podcast? I just want to book you right now. No, that's funny. I was wondering about how many interviews you've done, because this is going to be different from other ones. Because I was thinking, almost, I'm going to say maybe everyone listening to this is familiar with the history of your book in a way that the average reader is not. Like, this is a group of listeners who know in minute detail exactly the history that you're writing about. But one part of what's exciting about your book to me is that you're writing about a part of Mary Queen of Scots' history that's so seldom discussed. So the average person doesn't know about the Lochleven situation, really, because when you look at, I mean, a while ago, we did an episode where we were looking at the Saoirse Ronan film, but the same thing happens in the TV show Rain and other things, where it kind of tells her story up to the point she's arrested, and then it's like time passes and then she's executed, where it's like, no, like so many interesting things happen after she's arrested, such as the Ocean's 11 level heist escape from Lochleven. And I think I said in the podcast we did about that part of her life, I was like, why is this not a movie? Why is this not a book? Like, this is such a good narrative. So I was curious to know how you came to decide to write a book about this thing that is such a great story. And I'm happy that there's a book about it now.
Yeah. So I was thinking about this ahead of this recording, how in one sense, it's a real shame that you hadn't sort of recorded your There's Something About Mary kind of segment on your podcast prior to me writing the book, because it would have been such an amazing resource for me. But then on the other hand, I think all the characters in Mary's life are captured so distinctively in your kind of voice on the podcast, that I think is testament to your skill as an oral storyteller. But I think that might have really coloured how I portrayed my version of the characters in the book. So, for example, I know in your podcast, the Earl of Moray is Hollywood icon
Yes.
Jimmy Stewart. And I think I would have had a real tough time getting that out of my head whilst writing the scenes with the Earl of Moray, because I love Jimmy Stewart.
Oh, it's true.
So yes, when I started writing the book, when I first had the germ of the idea for the book, I had never heard about this period in Mary Stuart's life. I was very interested in early modern Tudor history. I thought I knew sort of the kind of broad strokes of Mary Stuart's life. And obviously everyone knows about her long captivity in England. And then I stumbled across a kind of stray reference to her time at Lochleven Castle. And it is such a pivotal, action-packed time in her life, this 11 months. As you said earlier, it's a sort of Ocean's 11 type sequence of events. And it is so pivotal to her story. And I was very shocked that I'd never heard about it before, that often it is completely brushed over in retellings of her life. I remember very shortly after I came across that reference, there was a wonderful exhibition at the British Library in London, where I'm based, about Mary Stuart and her sort of relationship with Elizabeth I of England. And I went to that exhibition looking for references to Lochleven. I found maybe one line summarizing her 11 months there and her miscarriage. And sorry if that's going into spoilers a little bit.
Here's the thing. The people listening to this podcast know the history. So I don't think anything that's like the history is going to be a spoiler. We just won't talk specifically about... I was thinking, like, how are we going to do this? Because everyone listening to this knows the actual events. So I think we can talk safely about the actual events. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so this one line that summed up her that entire period of her life at Lochleven Castle, and I just found it extraordinary that this story in my mind, hadn't been properly told before. And I think something else that appealed to me was the fact that previously, in my mind, Mary Stuart had very much been defined by her relationships to the men in her life. So her 3 husbands, John Knox, the Earl of Moray, Hollywood icon Jimmy Stewart, or otherwise Elizabeth I, a woman who she had never actually met in real life. And there's this binary of Elizabeth I is the virgin, Mary Stuart is the whore. And what I really wanted to do was to reframe the narrative of Mary Stuart's life, to look at this slice of her life through the lens of female friendship. Because I think something that's extraordinary about Mary Stuart is because of she evidently was an extremely charismatic person, and she inspired incredible levels of devotion, not only in men, but in women too. And there are many women who remained extremely loyal to her throughout her life. I know you've spoken about Lady Mary Seton, who is one of the key characters in The Tower, my novel. And she was with Mary sort of for many decades, as were several other characters who your listeners might not know as well, who are introduced in The Tower.
I wanted to say, when I first got a copy, like an advance copy of your book, and it was the very beginning of your book, you have a list of characters. And first of all, I always love a book that starts with a cast of characters. I like that. But it was enough months after I had done the Mary Queen of Scots episode, I was just like, oh my God. And all the names of characters, I just got more and more excited. And some of them I had to be like, wait, what did I call this person? Oh, that guy. And remembering who is who. And I was so excited, especially, okay, so a bit ago, I did a giveaway on Instagram for an advance copy of your book. And my question was, which character are you most excited to see in this book?
What was the answer in the end?
The most popular answer was Mary Queen of Scots. I mean, fairly,
of course,
obviously. But in strong second place was William Douglas, aka Young Willy. People were really excited. And I was really excited. Actually, when Allison first read the book, I was like, Allison, is Young Willy in this book? And she's like, yes, he is. I'm like, oh my God. Because I'm such a fan of this little teenage dirtbag. I was really excited he's in your book. So honestly, I read the list of characters and then I had to like put it down. I was just like, I'm too overwhelmed. This is too exciting. It's a book starring all these people who I feel this like bizarre personal connection to, all in a book.
I'm really curious, were there any characters? So for example, with Willy Douglas, he is a little bit more kind of edgy. He is a dirtbag in The Tower. And I was wondering how that compared to how you had envisaged him when you were sort of kind of going through Mary Stuart's life for the podcast.
I was honestly just excited he was there at all because this story is so rarely told. And I'm like, but there's not a way to tell this story without him. He's such a crucial person in the like Ocean's 11 escape attempt. No, I was just happy he was there, full stop. But also, I mean, he's the one good Douglas, right? In that whole clan.
I feel like George, you're missing George. He's pretty great.
George is also good. You're right. George and Willy. Yes, they were the two good Douglases.
But we meet, obviously she's Agnes Leslie rather than Agnes Douglas because of the way that women didn't take their husbands' surnames during that period in Scotland. But we meet Agnes Leslie in the Tower, who is wife of William Douglas, and she is...
William Douglas Sr.
William Douglas Sr., yes, sorry.
We'll call him Young Willy, just so people know.
Yes, so William Douglas, not young Willy, and she is his wife. She is the lady of the household in name, but in reality, the lady of the household is her mother-in-law, Margaret Erskine, who I believe that you talked about in your podcast. She is the former mistress of Mary's father, James V. She is also the mother of the Earl of Moray, Hollywood icon, Jimmy Stewart. And I really wanted to focus on those two female jailers of Mary Stuart, in addition to the four central female characters, who I actually don't think we've spoken about properly. Shall I go into that?
Yeah. Who are the main characters of the book, Flora?
Yeah. So, in addition to, the book, it begins in, for anyone who hasn't listened to your wonderful episode on the Lochleven stage of Mary Stuart's life, the book begins in 1567, and it follows a young pregnant Mary Queen of Scots after she is defeated by the rebel Scottish lords at Carberry Hill, and she is imprisoned at Lochleven Castle, and she is accompanied by two chambermaids, the Scottish Jane Kennedy, and then the young French woman, Marie de Courcelles, who I call Cuckoo in the book. And then they're later joined by Lady Mary Seton, who is a lady-in-waiting and a childhood friend of Mary Stuart. And the book sort of centers on those four women and the kind of hothouse environment of the castle rooms and their interactions, the power shifts between them, tempers fraying, alliances shifting, and how these four women need to come together in order for there to be any hope of them escaping.
Jane and Cuckoo, are those based on actual people you know were there, or are they sort of like your imagining of what they would have been like?
Yes. So there are various sources that state that there were two chambermaids who were with Mary Stuart before Lady Seton was able to join her at Lochleven. So two chambermaids, not ladies in waiting. That was part of a kind of power play on the part of the Scottish lords that Mary Stuart wasn't furnished with any of her kind of the signifiers of her status. She wasn't given her proper wardrobe. She wasn't given her proper retinue of powerful young women. She was just provided with two kind of lowly chambermaids. And then later, Lady Seton shows up and kind of the balance shifts, the power balance shifts. The book kind of centers on how the shifting power dynamics between those four women, and also how kind of societal, how do I say this? I've lost the word, but how the boundaries between the women break down, like the kind of normal,
like the class distinctions?
Yes. So how the class distinctions kind of blur. The class distinctions kind of blur between the four women over the course of the book.
I'm excited that you wrote this book. I think it's a shame no one's written about this before. And I think, but that's to your benefit because you get to be the first one. Because everything you're saying, it's just like, yeah, like, so just to clarify too for the listeners, to recap, like Lochleven is an island, like it's an island castle where she's being held. So she can't easily escape. Like to escape is going to involve a boat of some sort. Someone has to row
Yes.
it. Like she's really trapped there. But then just as you're describing the dynamics of, there's been so many powerful men opposing Mary Queen of Scots up to this point. And then when she's in prison, she's mostly surrounded by women, which is, so that's also so fruitful. But also, yeah, what is it like to be for 11 months? It's like she's the queen, you're the chambermaid, but if you're all living basically the same life, yeah, of course those distinctions would blur. Like things would get weird. If any four people are stuck together, I don't know, like the Big Brother house or something. Like when people are trapped together in any situation, like things are just going to get weird. And then there's the heightened stakes, of course, of she's the queen, but then there's the whole thing about, is she going to be removed from being the queen? Is someone going to murder her? Is her food being poisoned? These aren't spoilers for your book. This is just me remembering the history of it all. So, like, of course, it's such a ripe situation, but then where it's so compelling in history, and then a gift to you, you're able to use this for your book, is the Mary Queen of Scots never, like, she isn't just like, okay, I guess I'm in prison now for the next 19 years of my life. I'll just lay back and let this happen. Like, she's constantly scheming and trying to find ways to who's there and who can help her and who's against her and who can she turn against who. Like, and you really captured that side of Mary Queen of Scots, which is a much more active presence than I think she's often portrayed as. Like, I think in a lot of, well, because every Mary Queen of Scots project ends with like 20 years later, she's executed. So it's kind of like you're telling this story and people see it as like a sad, like it's a tragedy. Like she lived her whole life just waiting to be executed. But your book does what I tried to do in the podcast, which is like, if you sit with her in that moment, she doesn't know what's going to happen next. As far as she knows, she needs to escape this prison and she's going to be queen again and everything's going to be amazing. Like, so to sit with her in that moment where she is still very committed to succeeding is a side of Mary Queen of Scots you don't often see. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, thank you. Thank you. That's wonderful to hear. Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day. I was thinking about what my kind of first introduction to Mary Stuart was. I was trying to remember, and I think it was the time slip young adult novel, beautiful book, A Traveller in Time by Alison Utley. And in that, Mary Stuart is a kind of walk-on role, but she is very much a kind of quiet, glamorous object of obsession for Anthony Babington, the Catholic lord who oversaw the Babington plot. And as you say, in that, it's a beautiful book, but in that, Mary Stuart has really absolutely no agency of her own. She is imprisoned and kind of waiting around for loyal male supporters to engineer her rescue. And when I was sort of overlooking the kind of history of Lochleven and also more generally her captivity, that wasn't the case at all. She had a great deal of agency. She was an incredibly brave woman who oversaw various escape plots. I don't think history gives her enough credit. She, again, going back to that kind of binary that I spoke about, the Elizabeth I is the virgin, Mary Stuart is the whore. Either Mary Stuart is portrayed as the scheming Jezebel in history, or she is entirely stripped of her agency. There doesn't seem to be any in between. There's no kind of nuanced sort of portrayal of her sort of more broadly. And I think that is starting to change. But I really wanted to kind of delve into the nuances of her character, because she was such a complex person. She was incredibly dynamic and charismatic. She loved dancing. She loved her friends. She loved sport. She also suffered from depressive episodes. She had very bad luck with men, let's be honest. She was just such an incredible character to write. And I think there is a real responsibility when it comes to writing real people, particularly people who lived hundreds of years ago. And when it comes to, I don't know, like the question of anachronism, worked very hard to make sure that there wasn't any erasure of those parts of her character that might be less palatable to a modern reader. She was very much anti-abortion, for example. She also believed very strongly that she needed a husband in her life. There are reports of her telling the English ambassador after her wedding to Darnley that she needed a husband. She wouldn't be able to function without one. History will tell us whether she was right or wrong about that.
Well, obviously, everything you just said, like it's such a disservice to her and I think it's a result of like the propaganda that was being written while she was still alive. And then especially was sort of unearthed, like in the Victorian era, there was this big Tudor trend. So there's so many artwork of her looking sad and tragic and sort of like swooning and with a dog, always with a dog. But
she loved her dogs, the Skye Terriers. She loved the dogs. She loved animals.
I think someone said that. I think when I asked what character are you most looking forward to, I think someone did say the dogs. Yeah, so I think her story was always set against Elizabeth, like in her life when it was revisited by the Victorians. And also the Victorians, we blame them a lot on this podcast. But part of that, as I understand it, was Queen Victoria was like, I need people to trust in me as a young woman who's a queen. So like, I'm going to look back at Elizabeth and say, wasn't she great? So there's a lot of stuff being like, Elizabeth was great, and that means Victoria will also be great. Don't worry about it. She's a teenage girl, but Elizabeth proves queens are great. And if that's your intent, then you have to show Mary was terrible. If everything she did was great and correct, and she executed Mary, Queen of Scots, asterisk, she was like, what? I didn't sign that paperwork, but like she did. Therefore, Mary Queen of Scots has to have been the scheming Jezebel. And then I think in the Victorian era, that's where it's like, oh no, she's actually a victim. But it's like, but Elizabeth could not be blamed. So you have to like bend over backwards to make Mary be someone who it's okay that Elizabeth executed, because everything Elizabeth did has to be correct. And then were my podcast, like I was really happy to read so many of the more recent works about Mary Queen of Scots that delve into the more interesting stuff. And then as I was doing the podcast, I guess after you wrote the book, those letters were discovered, the ciphered letters from when she was in England that shows that she never stopped. Like she was writing these letters in code, like she was constantly trying to escape. Like that happened. Those letters were discovered just before I did the episode about her years in England. And so I'm like, okay, I had the impression she was sent to England and she's like, I guess I'll just waste away for 20 years. Like with my dogs, just do some embroidery. Who cares? But in fact, the embroidery was treasonous. Like she was doing these ciphered letters. Like,
yeah,
the actual proof of what she was actually like. And these letters show like her actual words, what she was writing, what she was doing, shows what she was actually like outside of this like propaganda of like, oh, she deserved to be executed or whatever.
I think part of her appeal, the reason people have been interested in her story for so long is that she is a very enigmatic historical figure, precisely because of those gaps in our knowledge. Just as you say, the reason for that is because for half her life she was in captivity and she was required to communicate via code. So through sort of ciphered letters, through embroidery. And I think that sort of not knowing is so attractive in many ways. There's that desire to kind of fill in those gaps. And maybe as a fiction writer, that is sort of part of the appeal when it comes to Mary Stuart, the desire to, I think for so long there's been this erasure of women's stories and LGBTQ stories. I think it's only a slight spoiler to say that there's a sapphic love story within the Tower. And I think one of the wonderful things about fiction is that it's this really useful tool in imagining those stories.
I can't remember who. I've interviewed so many authors on my podcast, but there was someone, I think a couple people I've asked this question and they've answered similarly. Why did you decide to write novel rather than a biography or a historical book? And it's because you can almost get, like, there's room for you to imagine. I'm assuming you're probably similar, but like there's room for you to imagine, but it's also a way that you can really, if you're writing a nonfiction book, like I am, which has just been announced,
yes, congratulations.
like you have to be like, here's the facts, here's what happened. Thank you so much. That news just came out this week as we're recording this.
You know what, Anne? I think my answer is the reason I wrote fiction is because at the end of the day, I am not a historian. I did a great deal of research for this book. I read many sort of biographies of Mary Stuart. I read very widely around the period. I visited museums, galleries. I immersed myself in the material culture of that period. I visited Lochleven itself.
You did? I was going to ask you. Oh,
yes, I did.
That's so cool.
But I think, at the end of the day, I am not a historian. I'm a fiction writer, and I owe a great debt to historians like yourself for really kind of delving into the archives and doing the amazing work that you do so well.
Thank you. And also, I think what I've learned from other historical fiction writers too is like, if you're only writing the historical document, like if you're writing nonfiction, you can be like, well, this happened, this happened, this happened. And like what I do is I'm like, I imagine what else is going on. But, if you're stuck to just, well, this is the record of what happened. And I think in a historical fiction novel, often that's how a lot of people learn history, because a novel is often more appealing to the average person than some sort of like dense book of facts and information. But that also makes you see the historical figures as people. There's a sort of historical truth to that also, because if all you're doing is saying, well, this is the letter and this is the official proclamation, well, that's what that person wanted to be written about them. But what were they actually like? What were they actually doing? And I think that's where historical fiction, especially like you were saying, for a lot of women's history, for queer history, like we don't have those records specifically of what people were thinking and doing. So it's a way to illuminate parts of history. Like, I was talking with Patterson Joseph, who wrote the book about Charles Ignatius Sancho, the like Black musician from the Regency era.
Yes.
And he has done so much. He spent his whole life practically just like reading about him and thinking about him. And he did a play about him. And I asked, like, well, why didn't you write a biography? Why did you write a fiction book? And I think because there's not enough stuff to write a biography, But if you write a fiction book, then you can take that and imagine it. And that's the gift that a fiction writer has. You can really delve into the history in a way, like if there's not enough facts to write a book, but you can extrapolate that. Like Mary, Queen of Scots and Lochleven, we know the events and what happened, but what you do in your book and what you're able to do, and obviously you did all this history, and I'm going to ask you about what it's like in Lochleven. But you can imagine where it's like, you can read in a book like, and she was there for 11 months. And you're like, okay, next paragraph. But for you, it's like, no, like if she's there, who is she with? Like, how insane are these 4 people going to get being trapped together? Like, how scary is it to try to escape and then to be caught? Like, and that's where your book really brings it all to life in a way that makes the history stick more, like that makes people appreciate it better than just a paragraph. It's like, oh, she was in Lochleven, she had a miscarriage, there was escape attempts. Like, moving on. Like, no, like, I want to read a novel about exactly that. And you wrote that novel, so thank you. But tell me about Lochleven. Is there a ferry? How do you get there?
Oh my goodness. So I am very much a writer who is inspired by place. So during my research period for this book, which took place over many months prior to actually ever putting pen to paper, I knew that I had to visit Lochleven before I fully committed to writing the book, because although there are sort of flashbacks within the book, the majority of it takes place on this island. So I knew that I really needed to be able to visualize it, and also that it was compelling enough for me to write about it. I wanted it to be very, very atmospheric. So the first time I visited it, I think it was in, was it 2021? It was a period of time when the sort of, in the UK, there was still kind of some lockdown restrictions in place, which meant that the actual castle itself wasn't accessible. So I remember...
Sorry, can I just say what I thought you were going to say? And I know I'm wrong, but I just want to let you know what I was thinking. And I was like, so you had to switch places with somebody, put on a disguise, hire a boat, sneak your way out. But that's not where you were going. Okay.
I visited it twice. If the second time the castle was still out of bounds for visitors, I think I probably would have just swam there. Yeah. The first time I just remember pacing up and down, back and forth, round and round the loch, just viewing the castle island from every angle. And it's this gorgeous place, this vast loch, this tiny island with the ruins of the castle and the area. There's heather, there are red squirrels. It is so beautiful, so atmospheric, exactly how I was hoping it to be. And then the second time I went back for research purposes, I was able to cross the loch via a little boat to get to the island. And it was a really strange twist of fate, because the boat in use that day, it was called Mary Seton. It had Mary Seton written on the side of the boat.
Oh,
and
perfect.
It just felt like this beautiful sign. It just thrilled me. And both times it really confirmed in me that this was what I wanted to write about.
So I've got so many more questions about your trip to Lochleven. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone. So we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural Then and Now.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. My first question is, and this is from history, this is not from your book, so no spoilers, but there's the part where, in history, where Mary Queen of Scots has arranged for this kind of group of people to be waiting for her on the other side of the loch, and they're not doing a very subtle job of hiding themselves or not making their horses make noise. And so Mary and young Willy have to distract people. That's in history. How far is the island from the shore? How far away is that?
It's pretty far, actually. It's I underestimated how vast in size the loch was. It's really, in person, it's such an impressive location. And it's almost intimidating when you're standing at the edge of the loch, because there are these wide, these high, almost mountainous hills surrounding the water. It's almost like I think I say in the book, like a giant lying on one side. So yeah, I think it's fairly far. You can see the land from the castle, but I think that helps explain why the fact that the party to whom you're referring to were a little bit obvious. I think that helps explain why the game wasn't up as quickly as one might have thought.
Yeah, because that part of the story I found very funny, because it's just do you know how hard she's worked on this scheme, and you're just standing there in the middle of the day looking obvious. But if it's further away, that makes sense. Yeah. If you don't know to look for them, that's interesting. So when you're on your little boat, the Mary Seton, going to the island, can you estimate how many minutes that was to get from shore to there?
Ooh, I would recommend any of your listeners, if they visit Scotland, if they visit Edinburgh, it's quite a short journey from Edinburgh to Lochleven. It's near Kinross, and it's really worth the trip. And I would probably estimate maybe like a 10 minute boat crossing from the jetty to the island jetty. So it must have been quite in Mary Stuart's time with all the rowing.
And was the boat you're in, were they rowing it with oars, or was it an electric boat?
It was an electric boat, I'm afraid to say. It wasn't a rowing situation.
Right. So if you're rowing, it might be a bit longer, depending on...
Yeah, probably.
The skill of the rower.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking...
I'm probably not...
Imagining being taken there, but then also trying to escape from there, which Mary does more than once. The suspense of those 10 minutes, 5 minutes, even 2 minutes would feel like an eternity if you're just in the middle of a loch being are we going to make it? Are we not going to make it? But actually, speaking of the boat, again, so I told you when I first got the manuscript and I saw the cast of characters, and I just got so excited I had to put it down because I was so excited. And then I'm okay, now a few minutes later, I'm like, I'm going to read this book. And then I started reading the book and I was like, oh my God, it's Lindsay. And I'm like, Lindsay, I know him. And then I had to put it down again. But I don't know. It's because I spent so long doing those episodes. I was thinking that was basically like me researching a book. So like 25 episodes or whatever I did about Mary Queen of Scots. But all these characters, I'm just like, I remember Lindsay because he's the one person not named James. Anyway, I was just excited to have people in it. And, Lindsay is awful. And I'm like, he was awful in your book. So anyway, can you explain how you dealt with the fact that everyone is called James in your book and all the women are all called Agnes?
Yeah, I was going to say, not just that, not just James and Agnes, but the fact that everyone's called Mary. So with the, so there's Mary Stuart, there's Marie de Courcelles, the French chambermaid who I nickname Cuckoo. And then Mary Seton, one of the four Marys, who is referred to, I think in your episode about the four Marys, you referred to her as Seton. And I coincidentally did so as well in the Tower. So those are sort of four very similar names. And then, so there's Agnes Leslie, one of Mary Stuart's jailers at Lochleven. She shares a name with the Earl of Moray's wife, who's also called Agnes, but who I called Anna in the book. And then with James, luckily, there aren't too many men in the Tower. The focus is more on the female stories. But again, just everyone in that period just seemed to be called James, just as in sort of with Hilary Mantel in Wolf Hall, everyone seems to be called Thomas.
I'm just thinking of, Philippa Gregory, she wrote a gazillion books about the Tudor era, but one of them was The Spanish Princess, which was made into a TV series. And I hadn't read The Spanish Princess, the book, but I'm familiar with the TV series. And there's 3 Margarets in that. And so one of them is Maggie. I
haven't read that. How did she? Maggie.
One of them is Maggie, and one of them is Meg. Like, you just have to do something, because otherwise it's uncontrollable. And that's where in my podcast, like, I got increasingly unhinged when like a new person called James enters the story, and I'm just like, I'm out of nicknames. There's no more nicknames. I can't think of what to even call this one. It's too many. And then another James shows up and I'm just, I don't even know. Oh yeah. So William Douglas Sr., who's in your book, I called him WD-40. I forget why. Like, by the time I got to that story, I was just like, this is too many names. And somebody did say him in my giveaway. They were like, WD-40. I'm like, oh yeah, he's in the book too. And I'm like, I forgot I gave that nickname. Yeah. But I've been reading recently for upcoming episodes about American history, like around the American Revolution era. And there's some real interesting names. And I'm so grateful because, like, I think it's a particular American thing, but maybe it's like a lower class British thing also from that era. Like, the wealthy people are all called Mary and James and Elizabeth. And then the children are all called like Hercules. And like, I don't know, like God bless. There's just, in this American history, everyone has a weird name that's different from everyone else. And it's just a treat for me after sitting in this Scottish history for so long.
Yeah, I think with fiction, that this is another thing, sort of the difference between historical biographies and then fiction. At the end of the day, you are serving the reader when you are writing fiction. And I think the reader is always intelligent. They always know this is fiction. They are clever enough to distinguish that this isn't a kind of historical biography. And they realize with renaming characters, it's just a way of easing the reader's journey into the story that you have written for them.
And I think that's a nice thing about historical fiction. I've talked to some other historical nonfiction writers, and one of them had mentioned she wanted to put in some nicknames for some of the characters where their names were so visually similar. And the editor's like, nope, because it's nonfiction. You can't do that. You have to just, is this ancient Frankish Kingdom where all the names are like very visually unfamiliar to most people. And the names are exactly the same, except the last 2 letters are different. And she's like, this is preposterous. Like everyone's going to confuse them, but they're like, sorry about that. That's the names.
Oh God, I couldn't do that.
No, exactly. And that's part of where I think you said like historical fiction serves the reader. And I think that's part of where, like for myself too, like I think a lot of historical characters I first encounter in historical fiction or in a film or something, because that's taking the history and making it approachable, making it intentionally understandable to a contemporary audience. And actually, that's another question I have about writing a book that's set in this like extremely long ago time period, but you write it for a reader of, 2024. How did you balance the way that people would have spoken, like the words they would have used? Like you don't want to be like forsooth or whatever. Like you don't want to alienate people, but you don't want it to sound too modern. Like how did you strike that balance? Or what was that like?
From the outset, I was very keen that I didn't want to do cod Shakespearean language. But I tried to convey some of the formalities of the language. And what I also did was, when I was researching for the book, I read some of Mary Stuart's letters, and there are some sort of lines or sort of little moments in the book where it's lifted or lightly adapted from what she herself wrote. So, for example, after her first wedding to Francis II of France, she wrote to her mother, Marie de Guise, and she said something along the lines of, "It was the happiest day of my life." And I have her sort of thinking that or reiterating that at some point in the book. It was a difficult balance, and I'm sure you have a lot of other fiction writers who probably say the same.
Did you have to? Just recently, I was speaking with a writer who she had written contemporary books before, and then she wrote her first historical fiction, and she was going on like various websites to be like, when was this word first spoken?
Yes.
Like, when was this metaphor first said? It's like, oh no, this was first said in, a movie in 1950. Like, I can't, like, did you have to go into that level of like, oh, this phrasing wasn't invented until, like, did you have to go through that process?
Yeah, there's what I remember very distinctly. There was like a back and forth between my US editor and I, where there was a scene where something happens to one of the characters, and then I write that she replays it in her mind. And when we were going through the editing process, I suddenly thought, I was very anxious about the use of the word replay, and because in my mind that's sort of associated with sort of, I don't know, like rewinding and replaying like a VHS or a DVD or like a video. But none of the other words that I could think of kind of conveyed the exact meaning that I wanted to sort of portray on the page, the visual aspect of her replaying the scene in her mind and how vivid it was to her. And I think we found an instance of that word in the end where it had been used in the 16th century. After all, I think we went on OED. I'm sure there will be some cases perhaps where a modern word sort of slip through. It is so hard to comb through an entire book's worth of language. But I did my very utmost best to try and capture the feel of the 16th century.
Well, and also, if you've listened to my podcast, you know that I love the television show Rain, for instance. So I'm not ever going to be a person who's like, that's not historically accurate. I think that, yeah, if you had, like your book, I think it's very Like anyone could pick it up and read it. It's not written like a Shakespearean manuscript. It's not oldie-timey talking. But yeah, for me, if some current words pop in, I'd be like, that's cute. I like that. This is like a little rain moment. But oh yeah, what I was going to say also is that so your book, because it's set in this very specific time period, almost all except for sort of flashbacks, like it takes place in this one setting, which is Lochleven Castle. So it's a bit of like the Lion in Winter vibes of just like people in a castle and they're all stuck together and they're going increasingly insane. I think it would be a great play or movie. Have you?
I feel very similarly, that I think I can see it really vividly on stage with like a revolving stage. I don't know why I can see that very clearly in my mind's eye. Sorry, what was your question?
No, I think I was just saying that out loud. And I'm glad that you've thought of that as well. Well, I don't know, just for me, just like it takes place all in one place. Like this could be not right. So then because it's all in one place at one time, and you have sort of like these key historical events, that happens. Like, there's this escape attempt and this is what she tried to do, for instance. But in your book, I like that you see how they think of those, because what we know from history is like, she tried this and it worked or it didn't work, but you have them, like this happens, and that makes them think like, we could try this as our, like, you see them, Mary Queen of Scots, coming up with the plans, which is a really fun, I hadn't thought about that until I read your book. And I'm like, how did she think of these plans? She didn't just show up on the island with like, okay, this is my plan, this is my plan. Like she had to see something that inspires her.
Yeah. Again, I wanted to give her back her agency in terms of conveying to the reader just how cunning and strategic she could be when she was really under pressure. She could really deliver in terms of formulating plans, escape plans. And this is sort of throughout her life, not just during this period. I know in your podcast, you've covered the period in her life after the murder of David Rizzio, and just the bravery and the fortitude that she exhibited when she sort of faked a miscarriage and was able to escape right from under the noses of the Scottish lords after that period. It's just extraordinary to me, I think, still.
And I think it's similar in this to that, in the sense of, it's a funny thing with Mary Queen of Scots. It seems to me she comes up with these incredible plans, this incredible bravery. A lot of it owes to the fact that she's surrounded by people who are so loyal to her. Like you were saying, she was so charismatic. Like the escaping after the Rizzio murder, like she had the help of the woman with the chamber pot, like passing secret notes. Like, and then the men didn't think to be mistrustful of the women servants. Like she knew that when the odds are the worst against her, it's when her best plans come out. Like she's somebody who really thrives under pressure where somebody else would buckle. And the whole sequence of events in the tower, especially early on, like she gets there. I mean, she's been arrested. They're trying to get her to abdicate. She's pregnant, which is always difficult for her because she has these various health conditions. Like things could not be worse for a person, for her in this situation. And yet, like, so you see her at these lows, like these incredible lows, like we mentioned, the miscarriage and everything. And yet I think people who skip over this part of her life imagine she would just sort of lie around there being like, I'm in jail now, I guess I'll just be sad. But the fact that in the worst situations, that's where she succeeds the most is like an interesting character trait of hers, but also I think a gift to you as a writer to have somebody, because when you're writing fiction, it's always like, the stakes have to be high, like how can you increase the stakes? And it's like, that's all there for you. Like things could not be worse for her. But she's the sort of person who overcame that.
I think one of the both brilliant and very difficult things about Mary Stuart is that she is a contradictory person in many ways, where she has these flashes of brilliance, but then also during her life, she does make these decisions where in hindsight, you question her decision-making capabilities. So, for example, when she decides to go to England after the events at Lochleven, for example. But I think that's one of the joys of her character, that she isn't just one thing, she is multifaceted.
And also, I think things like, and what I strive to do in my podcast too, and why it was, 700 episodes long, was because so much, it's so easy to look back and be like, oh, that was a bad decision she made. But so I tried to look at well, here's the things in front of her. These are the options that she would have seen. This is what she would have thought. And here's why she made that decision. It's so easy to criticize anybody and be like, oh, why would she marry Lord Darnley? It's like, how could she have known that he was the worst human being in the world?
I agree completely with you. And one of the things I tried to do with the Tower was sort of explain her decision making. So, for example, her decision I kind of give her the germ of the idea of fleeing to England within the Tower. The idea that if the next phase of her plan fails and she's defeated by the Scottish lords again, that she will go to England instead of France, where she was a dowager queen. And there were various reasons for that, and I don't want to go too much into spoilers, but one of the reasons, for example, is that she had a difficult relationship with her sort of first mother-in-law, Catherine de' Medici. So that's one of the reasons that I go into.
Yeah, it's when I think in the first Mary Queen of Scots episodes I did, but also just the way that I approach anything in history, or the way that I find myself falling into patterns and I force myself out of it, where a terrible thing that's going to happen to somebody. It's so easy to be like, well, here's the sad life of so-and-so. Let's look at her life knowing that Cleopatra, we know that at the end she's going to kill herself. So how did she, but it's like, no, if you sit in the history and you look at it moment to moment, I don't like how people like Mary Queen of Scots, it's like, oh, it's a sad story. She had a tragic life. It's like, no, her death was tragic, but that doesn't retroactively mean her life was tragic. And she had so many victories throughout that get forgotten. It depends. Someone like Catherine of Aragon, I mentioned the Spanish princess before, but that's a victory for her when she marries Henry VIII in the first place. To both of them, they're like, this is great. This is our happy ending. And that's, if you stop the story there, it is. So, it just depends where you start the story and where you end the story, if it's happy or not. And Lochleven, anyone who's listening to this podcast to this point, it's she does escape from there at the end. This is the people listening to this know this. And you just mentioned she gets to England later. But this is a part of Mary Stuart's life that does end with a success. And it's nice to have a book like that in the world. That's not just another, oh, her sad death, the end.
Yes, you're totally right in that with fiction, the writer is asking the reader with historical fiction to suspend their disbelief, to sort of suspend their foreknowledge of what's to come. With Mary Stuart, it's very difficult because the end of her story is perhaps the most famous part of her story. So it is a real balancing act. And I walk a really fine tightrope in the book where I do foreshadow and in a few instances sort of call out exactly what's going to happen to some of the characters in the book. But at the same time, I am asking the reader to suspend that foreknowledge and focus on the moment in time that the Tower is set in. And that's partly why I wrote it in present tense rather than past tense, because it lends that sense of immediacy.
That's so interesting to think about. Writing a book about a historical person, and this is the example I'm going to say is Shakespeare, for instance. When he was writing one of his history plays, the audience knows what's going to happen to whoever, Henry V later on. So he's writing it knowing that the audience knows what's going to happen, but you still are there having a nice time wondering oh, is he going to succeed or not? So yeah, that's such an interesting fine line for you. Yeah, just, I don't know. It'd be like writing a book about some nice part of Marie Antoinette's life or something where it's like everyone reading it is just like, we know she's gonna have her head chopped off. But you're like, yeah, but that's not what this book's about. Like, yeah. So I do like that there's sort of those nods, because your book is very I don't want to say like the mind palace, but there's a lot of sort of like inside the inner world of people, which I think when you're trapped in a tower for 11 months, your inner life does get. What else do you have except sort of your thoughts and your memories? Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of the book is sort of told, it's third person narrative, but it's quite close to one particular character, which is Jane, who I mentioned before, the young Scottish chambermaid. And she is a very interior person. She has a very rich inner life, but she is quite quiet and reserved. And I think part of the joy in writing the book was sort of we slowly learn more and more about her and the importance of that Mary Stuart holds for her in her life, and what exactly she will risk and sacrifice in order to maintain her position in Mary's retinue.
And that's why I think, the stage play, she would have a lot of soliloquies.
Oh, definitely. She would kill those. She'd be great. That's killer casting. The main character, I think.
Yeah. So I wanted to just talk to you and also everyone about the book club nature of what we're doing with this book. So what I'm going to be doing is on Instagram and also for free on Patreon, I'm going to be posting like a discussion question every week. The first of which will be there today when people hear this episode. And so you are welcome to, I would not blame you at all if you're just like, I don't want to know what people are saying. But if you want to pop in, like I know you're on Instagram, you can kind of see what people are saying. So you may or may not want to involve yourself. But then what we're going to do, you and I, is we've made a date about a few weeks from now where we're going to record a video conversation.
Yes. I'll be wearing makeup for that recording, for sure.
I will be, I'll probably not be sitting in front of my dish rack at that point. But yeah, and what that conversation is going to be, like that'll be questions that have come up from listeners, I think, like once people have read the book. And that's where we can get into like a more spoilery discussion of your book itself.
Yes, I'm so excited for that.
Yeah, and I hope that'll be fun for you too, because I'm sure it's very challenging for you, not in this interview, but in other interviews, to explain what your book is about without saying what happens in it. So that'll just be like a nice catharsis for you to just be like, yeah, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the last page. Let's talk about. So that's coming up, listeners. There's going to be discussion questions on Instagram, just in the main grid, as well as on Patreon, and all the links I'll put in the show notes for how you get there. And then, yeah, and so stay tuned for our follow-up conversation, both of us looking very glamorous on video. But so your book is just coming out like the day that this episode comes out. I think your book came out yesterday. And I think it's simultaneous in North America and the UK. Is that correct?
In North American territories, the book will be published on the 5th of March by my wonderful US publisher, Doubleday. And then on the 7th of March, it will be published by my wonderful UK-based publisher, Hutchinson Heinemann, which is a Penguin imprint. And that will be, I think, available in the UK and Commonwealth countries.
That's interesting. 2 days apart.
Yes, so 2 days apart.
The week that people hear this episode, you can either buy the book or you can buy it tomorrow, depending on where you are. But so that way, which is also, I think, really helpful, and part of why it's the book club pick is just people from various countries can all read it at the same time. Sometimes there's a 6-month gap between the UK publication and the North American publication. So it's coming out. And what do you have planned? What events are you doing for the launch week?
So I'm doing a few UK-based bookshop events in the lead up to the launch. And then on the actual launch day itself, I'm doing like a little launch party for my friends and family in Covent Garden in London, which will be really fun. And yeah, so far I've done a few really lovely events. I was at Cheltenham Literary Festival last year, which is quite a big UK-based literary festival. There are a few other things in the pipeline, but I'm not sure I can talk about them just yet. But yeah, very exciting. Very exciting.
To have it. I've been following, I mean, I follow you on Instagram and I've seen you've been taking pictures at different bookshops and things. And so it'll be so nice for you to actually have the actual book out in the world, I think.
Yeah, because The Tower is my debut book, everything is brand new for me. It's very surreal and exciting, and I'm not taking anything for granted. I'm just trying to enjoy every moment, like this wonderful podcast recording that we've just done.
And I'm happy to help support the book as well. But just as soon as I heard about it, and I think that was before I had started doing book clubs. And then when I did, I'm like, this is a no-brainer. It's like, of course we need to do this for Vulgar History Book Club. Like, this is an iconic, like, that episode I think was one of the most fun that I recorded. It's such a fun story, and partially because it had, like, she does escape. Like, I think we did the recordings for that. My friend Allison and we did 2 recordings that day. And the first one was just like her marriage to Bothwell, which is like the darkest, most depressing era. And then we recorded Lochleven the same day afterwards because we both needed to kind of end with a happier story. But anyway, it's a story that I think really resonated with people. Like young Willy, people are really excited. I was so excited. He's in the book. Anyway, I think it's so vulgar history coded. Like you mentioned, there's like this sapphic love story as well. Like we're all about queer representation on this podcast as well. So it's just like, it's everything. And I'm really excited to talk about this book. That's the other thing. I read it and I was like, I can't talk about this with anyone because it's not a book yet, but soon.
So soon it will be.
Okay. So where can people, so tell people where they can keep track of your activities and stuff.
Yes. So I'm on Instagram at Flora Carr with 2 R's, 13, Flora Carr 13. And then on Twitter at Flora Carr _. So you can follow me on both those platforms.
Just to keep up with, because I imagine this will be, I don't know how much you generally post on social media, but like the amount of events and things you have coming up, I think there'll be a lot to keep up with you in the next couple weeks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have this like month-long journey with you and your book. And I'm excited also for our next conversation because then I can be like, how did it go? What's it been like? What's the response?
I'm so excited for our next conversation. I'm so excited for us to be able to talk about so much of the book and so much what I hope your listeners will like about the book is the interpersonal dynamics between the sort of 6 key women. So Mary, Seton, Cuckoo, Jane, Agnes, and Margaret Erskine. And I'm so excited for your readers to sort of delve into that and for you and I to be able to discuss that.
Exactly, without having to be like, ooh, can I say that? Yeah, but so that's coming up later this month, listeners. But yeah, so again, you can keep up with the book club about this book on Instagram and on Patreon. And The Tower by Flora Carr. Like, buy it, read it, borrow it from your library. If your library doesn't have it, send them an email saying, please buy this book. Yeah, just acquire it. I think it's going to be a really fun month. And thank you so much for joining me and for being our book club author this month.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Anne.
So, The Tower by Flora Carr is a book that you should be able to buy. So, this week. If you're in North America, it should be in your bookstores now. If you're in the UK or the Commonwealth, it should be in your bookstores tomorrow. I mean, go on this weekend, stop by your local independent bookstore or wherever to pick it up. If you place a library hold, usually as a person who works at a library, it can sometimes take like a week or two for the book to get to the library because there's all those labels and cataloging they have to do. But place your library holds, like, let's read this book. Like, let's all read this book. And I'm going to be posting discussion questions. So if you go onto Instagram today, March 6th, on Instagram, I posted the first discussion question, which is just like, are you hyped for this book? What are you most excited to read about in it? Which person or situation or thing? Are you excited? Are you curious about who is the sapphic love story going to be between? Like, just that's just our first discussion question, just like everyone being excited about it. And then if you go to vulgarhistory.com/book club, or if you go to Patreon, there's a book club collection there. We're going to have some discussion questions there as well. So you can take part. And I think today that discussion is going to be the same question there, just like, what are you most excited about? So we're going to be talking about the book all month on Instagram and also on Patreon. And again, this is a free thing. The book club stuff on Patreon is always free. You don't have to, you can join with a free membership in order to take part. And then in a few weeks, we're going to have the follow-up conversation with Flora, where we're going to get into all the spoiler discussion. So leading up to that, I'm going to post one of the weekly questions will be like, what questions do you have for Flora? And then, that'll be involved in that. So like all month, it's the Tower month. We're just dusting off that Mary Queen of Scots part of all of our brains, remembering all these people, like young Willy, God bless. It's such a good book. I'm really excited to talk about it with all of you. So yeah, on Instagram, and then vulgarhistory.com/book club is where you can talk about it. And all the links to buy the book and stuff are in the show notes as well. My news, and we alluded to this in the podcast a little bit. Can you hear Hepburn? She's purring here right next to the microphone. Anyway, my news is that, do you remember in the Caroline of Brunswick episode, I mentioned that the existence of this podcast was kind of a long con because I wanted to write a book about Caroline of Brunswick, but I had to sort of make myself a notable enough person that somebody would want to buy a book that I wrote. It worked, Tits Out Brigade. I'm so excited to let you know that an imprint called Hanover Square Press, which is part of HarperCollins, is going to be publishing my book about Caroline of Brunswick. It's called Rebel of the Regency. And what does that mean? Well, it means I'm going to have a book, so I'm going to have to do an episode where I interview myself, I guess. But I need to write the book now. That's going to have some trickle-down effects on the podcast this year. There's always going to be a weekly episode. I'll keep you updated as to what's going on with the podcast. But basically, thank you to all of you, the Tits Out Brigade, because, I spoke my dream onto the podcast and I asked for your good vibes. And, a few weeks after that episode came out, the editor, Eden from Hanover Square Press, put in an offer to buy my book project idea. So I feel like the Tits Out Brigade, you're all kind of my fairy god people in that whole situation. So anyway, that's my personal news. The Vulgar History news is just, we're all going to read this book, The Tower, and we're going to talk about it. And I am so excited for that to all happen. And yeah, so Instagram, we're Vulgar History Pod. And that is where the book club discussion is going to be. And that's also where you can just come see what I'm up to and whatever. And we have merch available. If all of this Mary Queen of Scots talk has you all up in your feels about Mary Queen of Scots, we have, there's various Mary Queen of Scots merch designs. There's one that's like the names of all the four Marys. It's like Seton and Fleming and Livingston, like that sort of look. There's also John Knox saying whores. There's Where's Your God Now, John Knox. Constant bestseller of my merch. Anyway, so you can get Vulgar History merch at vulgarhistory.com/store. Or if you're outside the US, the shipping is a bit better if you go to vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. And if you're just like, I feel like getting some jewelry that is a tribute to some difficult women, then you should check out our brand partner, Common Era Jewelry. So this is a women-owned small business that makes jewelry with lots of women that we've talked about on the podcast and other women from history. So, the most tangentially close to Mary Queen of Scots would be the Anne Boleyn pendant, but there's also lots of people like Boudica, Cleopatra, Agrippina, pendants, rings. It's all jewelry inspired by, and there's also like muses and people from ancient Greek, Roman mythology. It's beautiful jewelry that's all a tribute to the kind of tits out women who we like to celebrate on here. I personally have the Medusa necklace just because I love the concept of a lady with snakes for hair who turns men into stone. Anyway, when I say she's a brand partner, I mean that we have a discount code. So if you want to get some pieces from them, you can get 15% off all items from there by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar at checkout. That's commonera.com/vulgar or use code vulgar at checkout. And you can get in touch with me. There's a form at vulgarhistory.com. If you want to get in touch with me, you can also email me, vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. And transcripts of recent episodes are available at vulgarhistory.com. Thank you to Aveline Malik from The Wordery for providing these transcripts. And, you know, it's a big episode this week. I had that personal news to share, but also this book club. Like, I'm unbelievably excited about this book. It's like it was written just for the tits out brigade. Like, I mean it when I say, like, I picked it up and had to keep putting it down because I was so overwhelmed with emotion of just seeing the names of these people and the fact that this book exists. It's like Flora wrote this just for us. So I'm excited to talk to you about it in the book club all month. And until next time, everybody, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Sheshin Morachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes.
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.